Welcome back to educator.com. Today we're going to go over the American Presidency. This is actually one of my favorite topics within the AP government curriculum. So let's get started here. So in today's lesson overview, we're going to examine the constitutional origins of the presidency. So what were the Founding Fathers' intentions in developing this office? We're going to view the informal requirements of the presidency. And then we're going to understand the reasoning behind the passage of the 22nd and 25th Amendments to the Constitution. We're going to describe the impeachment and removal process of the president. We're going to explore the executive, legislative, judicial, military, and judicial powers of the presidency. And we're also going to provide an overview of the limitations of presidential powers. So let's get started right into the material here. So the constitutional origins of the presidency. So when you look at the origins of the Constitution, you can see the influence of Montesquieu and Locke really played a big role in the construction of the presidency. There really was a debate, and that arose over a single versus a plural executive. So the Virginia plan wanted a little bit more of a stronger executive, and the New Jersey plan wanted a plural executive. So they actually wanted two individuals to share the role of president, a co-president, so to speak. But the compromise was that you'd have the executive power vested in one president, but at the same time it would be checked by legislative and judicial. So again, whether our country could have survived a plural executive or weaker executive, it's hard to tell in retrospect, but kind of when you look at it, it seems to have worked pretty well, the role that the president has today. So there was a debate of what type of power to grant relative to the legislative branch. Now, it's not a coincidence that Article 1 deals with the legislative branch, Article 2 deals with the executive branch, and Article 3 deals with the judiciary. So when the Founding Fathers try to develop system of allocating power, the first article went to the legislative branch. So that kind of spoke to the idea that primarily this country would be dictated by the people through representative democracy. And the executive does represent that to a certain degree, but Congress is actually the better barometer of how the people are actually feeling, so to speak. Now, there are certain requirements, formal requirements to the Constitution that's required of the president. Article 2 of the Constitution establishes the following requirements. Number 1, natural-born citizen. Number 2, 35 years of age. And number 3, resident of the United States 14 years prior to the election. Actually, from personally speaking, I actually do not qualify on all 3 accounts. So personally, I've never intended to run for president, but not being a natural-born citizen precludes me from the presidency. As of the time I'm filming this right now, I am not yet 35 years old. So on that count, I'm not eligible for the presidency. And I became a citizen actually when I was a senior in college. So on that count, I am not eligible for the presidency as well. So, there's a lot of offices I am qualified for constitutionally. I can run for the Senate. I can run for the House. But the presidency is out of my reach. But I personally have no problem with that. But what's kind of interesting is that when Arnold Schwarzenegger was a little bit more politically popular than he is currently, there was discussions on a possible Arnold Schwarzenegger amendment, possibly adding the 28th Amendment to the Constitution. Never really gained a lot of traction, but there was the idea of removing the natural-born requirement because Arnold Schwarzenegger was not born in the United States. So there's always been talk here and there of adding a constitutional amendment to take away that barrier, but it's never really gained serious traction. The question, can someone become president if he or she was born outside the United States? And the answer to that is Technically, yes. John McCain was actually born in the Panama Canal Zone, which is controlled by the United States. Now, is that part of the United States? If you say yes, then yes, this falls under the category. If you say no, well, that's not part of the United States, then there was really no question as to his eligibility. Now, what happens if you're born outside the United States, but your parents are fully American citizens? Well, natural born citizens never really been tested, but scholars would. It's never really been tested, but scholars would argue that yes, just because you're not born in the United States does not necessarily disqualify you. If you have the rights to citizenship through your parents, then some argue that yes, you are qualified to become president of the United States. Now, what are some informal requirements? Now, again, this is not necessarily written in stone, but again, there's some informal requirements to the presidency. Political or military experience, absolutely. Basically, this is what I would consider the big three requirements. You've either been the vice president, governor, or senator. Now, it doesn't hurt if you had all three items on your resume. Now, again, what I'm just simply going to do, I'm going to go backwards up until we hit a military guy. Because, again, military experience, it can work. I would say in this day and age, not so much. Not that the military isn't considered a requirement, but I think in this day and age with the constant media attention and scrutiny, someone who is a military leader probably hasn't had to experience the level of scrutiny that maybe a vice president or a governor or senator has had to endure. So probably a military leader in this day and age with all the technology and social media probably would be better served going into politics first as a governor or senator before becoming president, if that's a goal. Again, not necessarily have to be the case. Wesley Clark tried to run for the Democrat nominee just from a military background, but wasn't given the nomination. So it is definitely possible, but generally, an informal requirement has to do with prior political service. So let's take a look at Obama. Obama was a senator from Illinois. He was basically a first-term senator when he ran for president. So relatively little experience. As far as most presidential candidates are concerned, he had one of the least level of political experience as far as qualifying for the presidency. George Bush Jr., he was a governor. He had been actually elected to his second term as governor of Texas, so qualified under that account. Bill Clinton, governor of Arkansas, so again, he was qualified under that regard. George Bush Sr., he was the first sitting vice president in quite some time to ascend to the presidency, but his jump from the VP to the presidency actually kind of validated the idea that the VP was a little bit more than it had been in the past. So today the VP is kind of seen as a stepping stone. Again, kind of depends on age. Will Joe Biden be a legitimate candidate for president? Probably not. Again, I could be wrong on this. Dick Cheney, when he was George Bush's vice president, he really had no intention on becoming president, as far as most political commentators would attest to. But typically, vice presidents have their own political ambitions, particularly if they're younger. But again, it's something that George Bush Sr. Kind of in modern times set the trend towards. Ronald Reagan, he was the ex-governor of California. Jimmy Carter, he was a governor as well of Georgia. Gerald Ford, he was never elected the vice president, but he was the vice president. Prior to that, he was Speaker of the House. So rarely are you going to see the Speaker actually become president. Actually, Newt Gingrich in 2012 actually did run for president as a former Speaker of the House. So it definitely isn't without precedent. Speaker of the House of any position in the House, gives you that leadership capacity to run for the president, media exposure. It just hasn't been done. And past speakers of the House, most recent ones, John Boehner, he was on the Tonight Show, recently, and Jay Leno asked him about his desires to possibly run for the presidency, and he emphatically said no. Doesn't mean that he absolutely wouldn't, but very unlikely that John Boehner would. Nancy Pelosi, former Speaker of the House, probably not a legitimate candidate for the presidency. Again, generally, you're going to find nationally or congressmen are usually, if they've been in the House, usually they go to the Senate, simply because it just makes sense. If you're a House member, it's generally harder to find the name recognition. For example, when Mitt Romney selected Paul Ryan as a vice presidential candidate, some folks were not necessarily floored by that selection, but the idea that you had a House member. Now, you had a prominent House member, but nonetheless a House member. So again, the qualifications for vice president, the informal qualifications, usually tend to mirror the qualifications for the presidency. Now, in 2008, John McCain surprised a lot of political observers by nominating Sarah Palin as the vice presidential candidate. But she was a governor of Alaska, so as an executive, she had at least the informal requirement of having been elected to governor. So President Nixon was also a vice president and senator as well. So he had the necessary political resume to becoming president. LBJ, another vice president and senator as well. John F. Kennedy, a former senator. And then you have to go all the way back to Dwight Eisenhower to get a military man in the White House. Again, times have changed significantly. And again, there are a lot of different, informal requirements. But again, serious contenders for the presidency usually either fall into the vice president, governor, or senator category. Now, in 2016, as far as potential candidates, if Hillary Clinton decides to run, she was the, senator from New York, no longer senator. She also was Secretary of State. So that would qualify her from an informal perspective. Rand Paul, current senator of Kentucky, Governor Jeb Bush of Florida, if he decides to run, or Marco Rubio, senator from Florida. It's one of those things where it just makes sense, because if you're not the governor, if you're not the senator, then it's hard to garner that national attention that's almost required to run in a national election. Now, other informal requirements, or again, if you look at past presidents, what characteristic do they share? They've all been married, with the only exception being James Buchanan, the 15th president, the president before the election of Abraham Lincoln. So, yeah, nowhere in the Constitution does it say you have to be married, but it would probably be a campaign issue if the president wasn't married. Again, I don't think the American public necessarily demands that a president be married, but it would look a little suspicious, and that might be a point of contention, a distraction, if a president were not married. Who would fulfill the roles of First Lady? White male, again, obviously before Obama's election. Prior to Obama's election, a white male president. Now, is it possible to have a black female president? Absolutely, it is possible, but it really has to do with the availability of the candidates that have the experience of vice president. We've never had an Asian vice president. We've had Asian governors and Asian senators, or Asian American governors and Asian American senators, but the pool is relatively smaller, so it becomes increasingly difficult to find a president when the pool of potentially qualified candidates is small. Now, again, we're probably at a stage where, we could definitely elect a female president. Hillary Clinton, came ever so close to becoming the first female president if she was able to get the Democrat nomination. Now, 2016 could be the case where Hillary actually does get the nomination and ascends to the presidency. So it definitely is something that the American public is ready for, whereas 50 years ago probably would have been out of the question. Now, Protestant or Catholic, usually, again, with John F. Kennedy's election, our first Catholic president, John Kerry in 2004 didn't win the election, but his Catholicism was a non-issue. So in this day and age, being Protestant or Catholic, any form of Christianity. Now, in 2008, Mitt Romney's Mormon faith, it became more acceptable in 2012 than 2008 to conservative Republicans. Now, definitely is going to be a barrier if you have a non-traditional Christian faith, particularly within the Republican Party. But in the general election, definitely not seen as much of an issue at all. So it goes to show the religious tolerance that kind of has become the political norm. Now, is it possible? Can an atheist or homosexual be elected to the presidency? Now, whether or not the American public is ready for a president to be an atheist or homosexual, answer is probably not, simply because the American public is probably very tolerant of both groups. But from a president, chances are you just have too much opposition, at least in the Midwest, central United States. Maybe in the coastal regions, not much of an issue at all. But again, as far as getting the broad-based support for the presidency, there's certain characteristics where it wouldn't constitutionally disqualify an individual, but for all intents and purposes, it would kill the candidacy. Now, term and succession. So the Founding Fathers created a single executive elected indirectly through an electoral college for a 4-year term. Now, again, the key here is indirectly. Founding Fathers never really trusted the people. Now, did they imagine at some point in the future that the people would actually make the selection for presidency? I can imagine that, that they left room for that. But this electoral college allowed people to choose members who were more educated, so to speak, and more current with who would make the best candidate. And they left it up to the people to select the electors to basically elect the president of the United States. Now, in practice today, it's actually the people that actually elect the president. I mean, through these delegates, they basically vote. For the most part, except for faithless electors, they vote according to the will of the people. Now, the Founding Fathers probably didn't intend for this to happen, but I don't think they would necessarily be surprised that it would happen today. Now, there are rumors that selecting the president should be based on a national popular vote or some other method, but there really hasn't been a serious outcry to change the way that the president is elected. Even in the election of 2000, when Al Gore won the popular vote, and yet George Bush won the electoral vote. If anything, it actually showed the beauty of federalism in our electoral college system. Now, as far as the term is concerned, George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, depending on what George Washington's motives were, informally created the two-term tradition. So the 22nd Amendment was added to the Constitution in 1951 to formally establish the precedent, also called the FDR Amendment, because Franklin Roosevelt was first elected in 1932, re-elected in 1936, re-elected yet again in 1940, and re-elected for a fourth term in 1944, even though he died in 1945. So he was elected 4 terms. So to prevent that from ever happening again, the Constitution added to the 22nd Amendment. So again, the Founding Fathers, did they originally intend for this to happen? Answer to that is probably no. They specifically did not have a term limit because of the idea that, if a president was popular enough with the people, why not allow a president to run for that third term? Again, there are pros and cons to this. But again, this amendment was added because, FDR, he broke that informal two-term tradition. And so it is now embedded into our Constitution, where a president can only serve 8 years, or actually 2 terms, 2 full terms, or less than half of another president's term, and 2 terms of his or her own. Now, the second amendment that really specifically dealt with the president was the 25th Amendment. So, upon the death or incapacitation of the president, the vice president becomes the president. Now, incapacitation, there's a procedure where the president will voluntarily relinquish power, maybe during surgery or some time where he doesn't have full capacity, or it could be like a hostile takeover. And again, that provision has never actually been used where a president proclaims that he does have full capacity and yet the cabinet overrules. But it is embedded in our Constitution. Okay, because the original Constitution, it was problematic because the Constitution was unclear regarding presidential succession. The first time this actually came into place was when William Henry Harrison, he was the 9th president of the United States. He died of pneumonia because he gave this really long inaugural address. John Tyler, the vice president, he was the vice president, so the question was, did he become president, or was he a temporary president? Was he an acting president? Now, John Tyler, he stubbornly refused to be referred to as the acting president. And so he refused to sign documents that had him as being the acting president or the acting presidency. In fact, a pejorative term, he was referred to as his accidency. But basically, John Tyler, his most important contribution to the presidency was that he firmly established, at least in practice, that as president, if the president dies, and the vice president becomes the president without question, and there would be no special election of sorts or anything of that nature. But the problem was, there was the president, but there was no vice president. And John Tyler was actually a subject of numerous assassination attempts. And so it would have been kind of a huge constitutional issue had he been assassinated. What happens as a result? So to kind of rectify that situation, and it took quite some time for this to take place after several presidential assassinations, the 25th Amendment firmly establishes presidential succession and disability. So the 25th Amendment basically was added to the Constitution. A lot of it had to do with security, reasons and protocol, with John F. Kennedy having been assassinated, and LBJ becoming the president, and so it became pretty clear that there really had to be a method for presidential succession and disability. So you can argue that the 25th Amendment was much more necessary than the 22nd Amendment. 22nd Amendment, you can argue that that's not the intention of the Founding Fathers, and it really creates this lame duck status that wouldn't necessarily exist were it not for a president's ability to run for a third term. And so you can see arguments why term limits is possibly a bad thing for the president. Now, in this day and age, why would anyone want to be a president, yet alone a president for 12 full years, with all the stress that goes along with it? But again, that possibility is not even in the cards for a president. Now, impeachment versus removal, I've gone over this, but again, this affects the presidency as well. So the reasons that Congress may impeach and remove a president include treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, does that include lying to a grand jury? Does that fall, or maybe not lying, but not telling the complete truth to a grand jury? Is that treason? Probably not. Is that bribery? Not quite. Is that high crimes and misdemeanors? Well, Republicans obviously thought that, yeah, that is high crimes and misdemeanors, while Democrats conveniently thought that this was not an impeachable offense. So, again, a lot of it has to do with politics. If you're a Democrat, yes, you believe it's an impeachable, or if you're a Republican, yes, it's an impeachable offense. If you're a Democrat, nah, not too sure. And if the situation's flipped, if you have a Republican president that's impeached, then you might, flip your argument. And same thing with Democrats. So impeachment and removal can be a hugely partisan affair. So again, the House impeaches while the Senate convicts and the Supreme Court presides. So a majority of the House is required for impeachment, so simple majority, while 2/3 majority is required to convict, which makes it extremely difficult to impeach and remove a president. There really hasn't been any serious calls for President Obama to be impeached or George Bush. You have occasional congressmen that broach the subject, but generally you don't have that again, unless it's for a serious offense. Now again, as I mentioned before, Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton were impeached but not convicted. So in executive powers, so what kind of executive powers does the President of the United States have? He basically is in charge of enforcing laws, treaties, and court decisions. Now, part of enforcing laws, the President issues executive orders to carry out policies. So the reason why the President might issue an executive order, he might see an existing law out there that's not being enforced the way he or she wants it. So the President may choose to bypass Congress and use his executive authority to enact measures. Now, obviously, it's going to be subject to review by the judiciary, but a president, maybe an angry president that doesn't have the cooperation of Congress, a do-nothing Congress, may resort to using his executive orders. Probably a situation where Congress is not too happy when the president frequently uses executive orders, but it's within a president's constitutional right to use executive orders. Now, specifically, it's not there, but because the power of the president, the power of enforcing laws is in there, it's implied, one of the implied powers of the presidency is to issue executive orders. Okay, another huge executive power is to appoint and possibly remove officials. So probably the biggest thing is to be able to appoint Supreme Court justices who remain for the rest of their life, again, subject to the confirmation of the Senate. But the president's ability to appoint someone for life has huge impact on the office. So the simple act of doing that, along with all the other lower judiciary courts, so that's probably one thing that you can actually see the difference, a huge difference in having a Republican versus a Democrat president. Obama has been able to name several Supreme Court justices to the bench, including Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, and so he's been able to add those Supreme Court justices with more liberal viewpoints, and so certain liberal justices, they feel comfortable resigning under his term, whereas very unlikely that you're going to see a conservative retire under President Obama's tenure. Whereas if you have a Republican president, then you're going to see Supreme Court justices strategically deciding to retire. So a president's ability to appoint Supreme Court justices and other offices plays a huge role in his his executive power role. Now, the one position that the president cannot remove is can the president remove the vice president? And the answer is no. Now, certainly the president can ask the vice president, "Can you step down and resign?" Because we are at odds with one another. And absolutely, the president can freeze out the vice president from any real responsibilities, but the vice president is a separately elected position and really is not subject to the president directly, but to the people. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Now, the reality of it is that the vice president is somewhat subject to the authority of the president in practice, but constitutionally that's not the case. So the vice president doesn't have to resign, whereas some positions where the president will ask for the resignation of certain positions, usually staff members will comply. But again, the president usually has the power to appoint, but not necessarily the power to remove, most notably the vice president of the United States. And the president can just assume emergency powers. That's what Abraham Lincoln did during the Civil War, suspended habeas corpus. So there are a lot of things that the president can do that might be constitutionally sketchy, but for the good of the country, there's certain things that the president might be able to do. And again, the president presides over the cabinet and the executive branch, which we'll cover more specifically in terms of the bureaucracy in the next lecture. Now, there's some legislative powers that the president has as well. The president gives the annual State of the Union message, again, with the expectation of a comprehensive legislative program. Now, the president is required to give a State of the Union address. Doesn't mean it has to be given through a speech, but Woodrow Wilson really set that tradition of actually giving a speech rather than a handwritten State of the Union. So it's one of these informal things that every president pretty much follows through on. And part of the requirements, informal requirements, is that the president is going to enact a very comprehensive legislative program. And in addition to that, the president will issue an annual budget and economic reports. Not only that, the president will sign or veto bills, but really the power of the presidency is the power of the bully pulpit and using the power of the presidency to really threaten a veto to get what the president wants. So very rarely will the president actually veto a bill, particularly if the legislative branch is of your own party. So it really doesn't make sense to veto something as the leader of your political party. So the president will propose legislation, not actually because the president doesn't have the power to introduce a bill, but through members of Congress, propose legislation and use his power of the bully pulpit to enact legislation. Again, a clear example with Obama, the most notable example was the passage of Obamacare. So it was termed Obamacare because this was Obama's legislation. But it was actually called the Affordable Care Act. The president also may call a special session of Congress. Hasn't happened since Harry Truman, but it's still possible to happen. The president has the constitutional ability to call a special session of Congress if they're on break. Now, the criticism of Harry Truman was that he used it as a political ploy. Now, it actually might have worked. So now, again, it could have been the case where Harry Truman was genuine about it. What he did was Harry Truman with approval ratings at 36%, not a very popular president, up for re-election. He called a special session of Congress in July 1948 and coined them the Do Nothing Congress in his presidential campaign. Now, so just by order of the Constitution, he called them into session. Now, he really didn't motivate them to pass laws as a result, but it really served his political purpose of saying, I called them into session and they did nothing. So that kind of stuck with the 1948 Congress, and again helped Truman defeat Thomas Dewey in the 1948 presidential election. Now, there are some diplomatic and military powers. So the president appoints ambassadors and other diplomats. So there's tons and tons of ambassadors around the world, and the president's really in charge of figuring out. Now, when the president is in charge, it's really his administration that does a lot of the vetting. Now, ultimately, the president is responsible, but there's no way that one person is going to be able to figure out everything. And so in certain cases, this is where senatorial courtesy might work in terms of certain positions, judicial nominations. And again, usually it's the staff that is responsible for coming up with qualified candidates. So the president negotiates treaties and executive agreements. Very rarely will a president negotiate a treaty with another country unless it's really significant, simply because a treaty requires 2/3 approval of the Senate, whereas executive agreements can just take place between the heads of state. The president meets with foreign leaders in international conferences. The president accords diplomatic recognition to foreign governments. So the United States doesn't recognize North Korea as a country. Is it possible at some point? Yes. And that really is up to the president as a chief of state. The president receives foreign dignitaries. And really the big military power that the president has is they serve, or he or she serves, as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. That's why having military experience is definitely a plus when you're running for the president. Definitely not required. A lot of the recent presidents never really served in the military, but it does give you some credibility as commander-in-chief. Again, the president has the final decision-making authority in matters of national and foreign defense. And again, if there is chaos in the United States somehow, and the president assumes military power within the country, the president is responsible for providing for domestic order. So there are a lot of different hats that the president plays. Probably the most difficult job to have, not only in the United States, but perhaps in the entire world. So there's a lot of responsibilities that are given, and a lot of powers that are bestowed upon the president of the United States. Some judicial powers as well. They appoint members of the federal judiciary. As I mentioned, the Supreme Court, that's a huge, huge power, because once appointed and confirmed, Supreme Court is appointed for life. So it's a huge responsibility, and one of the reasons why a lot of party activists within the party or interest groups will lobby heavily for a candidate that favors their ideological view, because precisely the president is in charge of appointing the next Supreme Court justice that's going to have an impact on public policy for years upon years after the president actually leaves office. The president can grant reprieves, pardons, or amnesty. Now, very rarely will the president actually grant a pardon or reprieve during the beginning of his term. And again, whether or not a president actually decides to actually utilize this or not tends to happen at the end of the presidency. There's no rule that requires George Bush to wait until January 19th of 2008 or 2009, or there's no rule that requires Obama to wait until midnight of January 19th, 2017 to issue pardons. But generally, presidents will look at a list of potential pardons and or potential cases, and the president can act as a judge, so to speak, and pardon an individual who's been convicted of a federal offense, or can pardon someone from being prosecuted. The most famous most infamous pardon was when Gerald Ford used his power to pardon on Richard Nixon, and a lot of individuals, a lot of presidential scholars would argue that that's what cost him the presidency in 1976. He gave a speech saying the long national nightmare is over, and perhaps he did what was good for the country at the expense of his own political future. So some folks might argue that Gerald Ford could have won the presidency had he let Richard Nixon been prosecuted for his alleged crimes. But because the President of the United States has the ability to pardon, there really was no recourse other than to accept it. So some people might have been upset at that Richard Nixon wasn't given time in prison, but because the President of the United States has the ability to pardon, that's one of the huge judicial powers the president has. Or amnesty. So in regards to usually this has to do with immigration. So the president can grant amnesty to certain individuals, but again, generally the president is going to withhold using a lot of these judicial powers until the end of his term or presidency. Again, the president is also the recognized leader of the party. Again, before lame duck status hits, President Obama is the leader of the Democrats. Who's the leader of the Republicans? It's kind of hard to tell because there's a huge split between the moderates and the Tea Party. So right now there's a fight to see who the leader of the Republican Party is. Now, once Obama hits the lame duck status, which again, not too far away or might be in it right now, it's the mantle of party leader is being sought after by aspiring presidential candidates. And so, but until then, the president usually serves as the leader of the party. Again, the president chooses the vice presidential nominee, usually in conjunction with other party leaders or trusted advisors, but it's ultimately the president. The buck stops here with the presidents. And the president strengthens the party by helping members get elected and or campaigning on their behalf. Again, unless they're unpopular. Not too many Democrats aligned themselves with President Obama in 2012 and in 2010, simply because of the unpopularity of Obamacare. Again, depends on what your constituency is all about, but sometimes congressmen will ride on the coattails of the president, and sometimes they'll try to completely divorce themselves from the president, depending on his or her popularity. So again, in 2008, it was pretty accepted that George Bush was not a popular figure, and George Bush knew it himself, and so he didn't even appear at the Republican National Convention where John McCain was nominated. He actually spoke via video conference, and it really depends on the popularity of the president. One of the mistakes that Al Gore made, and perhaps caused a source of friction between Al Gore and Bill Clinton. When Al Gore was running for president in 2000, he really didn't utilize Bill Clinton, rather try to kind of stay away from Bill Clinton, even though Bill Clinton was a very popular and acknowledged leader of his party. So you can argue that if Al Gore had utilized Bill Clinton a little bit better, maybe just even in Florida, it would have been President Al Gore in 2001 rather than President Bush. And so the President of the United States, they appoint party members to government positions through patronage. And they basically influence policies and platform of the party. Now again, they might not have the huge impact, but the president, as the President of the United States, they can frame certain issues and put emphasis on certain things that if you're not president, you simply can't do. Now, there are certainly some limitations on presidential powers. So there are certain things that the president cannot do. And so there's a congressional checks on the on the president, which include the following. Overriding presidential veto. So the president can veto, but Congress can override the veto with 2/3 majority. The power of the purse. So budgets must be authorized and appropriated by Congress. So the president can't unilaterally say, okay, we're going to do this and that with the budget. It's the Congress that has the ability to adjust how money is spent. So, the president, excuse me, the president of the United States has the power to send military troops abroad, but it's really Congress that has the power to fund the military. So, who has more of the power? Some would argue that the president actually has more power because they're the ones that are actually sending the troops to a foreign region. But, Congress, they limit presidential powers by either agreeing to fund or not agreeing to fund any military ventures. Also, again, the power of impeachment limits the president's powers. Approval powers over appointments. Congress can, or the Senate can filibuster certain nominees if there's no supermajority. And again, the War Powers Act, theoretically, again, limits the president's ability to use military force. So the War Powers Act, it says the president is, they must basically notify Congress and provide a rationale. But again, the constitutionality of that has been questioned. So for the most part, the president has a lot of power, but basically there's certain things that the president wants to do, if anything, for public relations and for media purposes. Not necessarily a requirement, a constitutional requirement, but generally speaking, before the President of the United States engages in military conflict, usually the President gets approval through a joint resolution, which has kind of the force of law, a joint resolution through Congress getting approval to fight in a conflict. Most notably in 2004, before President Bush went to technically not war with Iraq, but conflict with Iraq, there's a joint resolution to authorize force in Iraq, and Congress approved it. Using the information that they had, Congress approved it, and one of the things that really killed Hillary Clinton's campaign, and to a lesser extent John Edwards' campaign for presidency in 2008, was that both candidates actually approved the measure to send military forces to Iraq, whereas Obama did not vote for that. Now, he wasn't part of the Senate at the time, but again, so he didn't really have a record at that time, but it was very convenient for him because his campaign that really gained momentum for him was his anti-war stance. And again, presidents lack the ability to utilize the line item veto, which is a legislative power only granted to Congress. So again, this is the idea, separation of powers. The president has the right to enforce laws, but to create laws, line item veto would give too much power to the president to just selectively choose the laws that he or she wants. So that line item veto was determined to be unconstitutional. When a law is passed, when it goes through Congress, and again, all the time that Congress has spent creating the bill and getting the bill passed and going through the conference committee, the only option really the president has to, I mean, there are four options, but basically either accept it as it is or veto it. Now, the president can pocket veto it or let it become law without a signature, but basically the president can't say, I like this part, so I want this part of this law, and I want to reject certain parts. So the president does not have the unilateral power to pick and choose a bill. So, example number one here. So, which amendment to the Constitution limits a president to 2 terms in office or 10 years? So, is it the 12th Amendment? And the answer is no. 12th Amendment basically says that the president and VP elected together. So, this amendment was necessitated by the existence or the emergence of political parties. So this is kind of the political parties amendment. 22nd Amendment, okay, kind of again mnemonic, 2-2. A president is limited to 2 terms in office, so that's the answer. Okay, it's not the 23rd Amendment. That is the D.C. Electoral College Amendment, or the Michael Jordan Amendment. The most famous, number 23, moves to Washington, D.C. and is allowed to vote. 24th Amendment has to do with prohibition of poll taxes in presidential elections or federal elections. And the 25th Amendment has to do with presidential succession. So if a president dies, it formally establishes the vice president as the president and the mechanism by which the vice president is chosen. Okay, example number 2. Which amendment to the Constitution, which amendment, not to the Constitutional, but which amendment to the Constitution provides for procedures of presidential succession and disability? Again, just to piggyback from the previous example, it's not the 12th Amendment, not the 22nd Amendment, not the 23rd, not the 24th Amendment, but the 25th Amendment. Example number 3. The founding fathers originally intended for a president to be limited to how many years in office? So what was the original intent of the founding fathers under Article 2 of the Constitution? So what was the original limit? So the term was intended to be 4 years, but how many years did the founding fathers want to limit a president to? Was it 4 years? Not 4 years, not quite. Was it 6 years? Not quite 6 years. Not quite 8 years, and not even 10 years. The original intent was no limits. Again, one of the drawbacks of having that 22nd Amendment to the Constitution, limiting a president to 2 terms, the president, even if the president was not going to be reelected, in the 7th or 8th year of a presidency, the president is essentially a lame duck, and so that's kind of changed the nature of the game. So again, you can argue that there's a benefit in having that, but the founding fathers, they designed a system to have the president be able to run for office. Now, if the president wasn't popular enough, then there's a way to make sure that the president isn't the nominee. But again, that provision no longer exists. So really, in the 7th and 8th year of a presidency, president's a lame duck. There's very little incentive for members of the opposing party, in some cases the same party, to listen to the president. And so the president's agenda becomes significantly less ambitious in that 7th and 8th year of the presidency. Okay, example number 4. Which of the following individuals would not be disqualified for running for president in the year 2020? Actually, the way I structured this question in 2020, it would actually be a little bit different. But let's go ahead and answer it as if it were 2020. Gary Simpson, born in Atlanta, Georgia. So there's a natural born requirement. In 1994, do a little math. The student or this individual is actually born in the United States, never applied for a U.S. passport. So assuming this person, Gary Simpson, has lived in the United States all his life, but he's only 26 years old, so he is disqualified. So which of the following individuals would not be disqualified? So because Gary Simpson is disqualified from running for the office of the presidency, that's not the answer. So given that 1994, just on age requirements, which of the following would not be disqualified? So being disqualified means that that's not the case here. Juliet Park, born in Anaheim, California in 1994, but lived in Canada from 2000 to 2002. So again, those 2 years abroad doesn't disqualify her, but the fact born in 1994, again, only 26 years old, according to this here. So Juliet Park would be disqualified, so that's not the correct answer as well. Penelope Parsons, born in the U.S. Virgin Islands in 1985, has never voted in any election. So born in 1985. Okay, so again, using some math here. Not a whole lot of math on this exam, but if you have some math, then you might see something like this. So it's possible that Penelope here is 35 years old. Okay, maybe depending on the birthday, it might be 34, but let's just assume 35. It is possible. Born in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Now that's a U.S. territory, so Penelope has the full rights of American citizenship. So which of the following would not be disqualified? Or which of the following individuals would be constitutionally qualified? And so Penelope Parsons absolutely is constitutionally qualified. Now what about Michael McDaniels, a naturalized citizen from Ireland? Stop right there. Stop right there. Michael McDaniels cannot be president of the United States unless we have a 28th Amendment allowing naturalized citizens to become eligible for the presidency, which, if you look at it, it's kind of the ultimate form of discrimination. A naturalized citizen can basically do anything as a natural-born citizen, except become president of the United States. So Michael McDaniels cannot, so is disqualified. So this is not the answer. Now, Michael McDaniels has a pretty impressive political resume. Lived in the United States for past 30 years, served in the House for 10 years, and the Senate for the past 6 years. But guess what? He or she, or Michael McDaniels can't become president of the United States. And so none of the above is not the answer. So the only constitutionally qualified candidate for president of these choices would be Penelope Parsons, even though Penelope hasn't voted at all. And the final example, this is a little bit more of a lighthearted example. This is more of a movie or Hollywood a media recommendation if you want to learn a little bit about AP government, but you want to take a break and watch a good movie here. So what Hollywood movie starring Harrison Ford puts the 25th Amendment of the Constitution as a central issue? So dealing with presidential disability, Harrison Ford plays the President of the United States, and the airplane, which I won't name quite yet, has been hijacked, and terrorists have taken over. And the question that the vice president and the cabinet have to make is when the president's daughter and wife, when they're under the control of the terrorists, is the president of the United States acting as the president of the United States, or is he incapacitated and acting as a father and a husband? And so the vice president, played by Glenn Close, has the signatures of the majority of the cabinet declaring that President Harrison Ford, or President Ford is incapacitated, and it only requires her signature. But then she rips it up and allows Harrison Ford to maintain his status as the President of the United States. And what movie is that in? Is that 24? And again, that's not a movie, although if you do watch the 24 series, a similar situation actually does come up, in which the vice president takes the powers of the presidency from the president at the time, but it's not a movie. In the Line of Fire deals with Secret Service, starring Clint Eastwood. Dave, actually one of my favorite president movies, but this is a movie in which a president, in which the president of the United States actually becomes incapacitated, and there's a presidential impersonator that takes over. So the central focus is really on avoiding what happens in the 25th Amendment. So you can actually argue, on second thought, that this is a possible answer, because at the end of the movie, I'm going to ruin this movie for you. So if you don't want this movie to be ruined, just earmuffs. At the end of the movie, the president, played by Kevin Kline, Bill Mitchell, actually does die, and under the terms of the 25th Amendment, the actor playing the vice president, Ben Kingsley, ascends to the presidency. So the 25th Amendment is actually mentioned in this movie as well. The American President deals with what would happen if the president of the United States was a widow, and what would happen if he dated while in office. So it's a very interesting movie, and it shows Hollywoodized version of the American presidency. But the movie I was referring to was Air Force One, when the president is actually kidnapped, figuring out whether or not the president is incapacitated under the terms of the 25th Amendment. So you can actually argue that C and E are the correct answers. And again, I would recommend, if you want to take a break and actually learn a little bit about the American presidency, Dave and Air Force One are great movies to watch. Thank you for watching Educator.com.